Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh the facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and pony owner. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing easy keepers on multiple acres of pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and like all good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We talk about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode.
Poor hoof quality is something that many horses struggle with, and their owners struggle equally trying to fix. Most of the horse owners I've worked with who are in this situation understand and believe that nutrition plays a key role in their horse's hoof health, and they're correct. The number one go-to for hoof issues is typically a hoof supplement. But what is it in a hoof supplement that would make it beneficial, and do they actually work? Today we're going to talk about whether diet really can improve hoof quality.
When we're talking about hoof quality, what are we actually talking about?
Yeah, so the hoof is a very complex anatomical structure. Some of our listeners may have been lucky enough, if they've been to their vet clinic or whatever, to have seen like a cutaway of the horse's hoof and lower limb, and it's fascinating, right? There's several bones, tendons, ligaments that insert into the hoof, and then there are other forms of complex tissue as well. And in my experience, when horse owners are talking about hoof quality, though, they're typically talking about the quality of the hoof wall that makes up the outside of the hoof capsule and the sole of the hoof, which is also part of that capsule, and the bottom surface of the foot. And then to a lesser extent, they might be talking about frog quality or heel conformation. Someone might say that their hoof has bad hoof quality because the frogs are small and narrow and the heels are what we call underrun. But generally, I think when people are talking about hoof quality, they're really focused on the quality of that hoof wall. And, I definitely hear people say that their horses have thin soles, right? That's something you hear. So that's sort of something else I think that kind of gets, thrown in with hoof quality. And in my mind, these are more a function of the things like the narrow heels, the underrun heels, the narrow heels, the small, narrow frogs. To me, those are more a function of how the hoof is managed by a farrier or hoof trimmer, and less to do with nutrition than the quality of the hoof wall and sole. Although I'm sure there are folks out there that would argue with me and definitely say there's a nutritional component, and I would agree there is definitely a nutritional component to the quality of your horse's frogs as well. But I think more often when we're thinking nutrition and the foot, we're thinking wall and sole.
If, for now at least, we focus on the hoof wall and the sole, what are these structures actually made up of?
So the hoof wall and sole are part of, as I mentioned, like something that we refer to as a hoof capsule, which encapsulates the inner structures of the hoof. And the hoof capsule is at the same time both rigid and flexible, right? It's kind of this strange sort of like, how can it be both? But it is both. It's both rigid and flexible. The toughness of the outside wall allows the hoof to withstand large amounts of pressure. And obviously it needs to be somewhat flexible as well so that it can deform under that pressure. Otherwise it would just split, right? Or potentially break. So the hoof wall, if we really get into the sort of nitty-gritty of it, the hoof wall is made up of 3 layers that extend from the outer surface inwards. So if we start with the outer surface and work our way in, and those layers attach the cells ultimately between the coffin bone within the foot and the hoof wall itself. And that layer that's nearest the coffin bone and the hoof wall is called the dermis. But if we go back to the outside of the foot, that first layer is called the periopal, and that's a thin membrane-like layer that grows down from the top of the hoof, and it lines the top of the cells where the hoof meets the skin. And You may have seen that. I think people who keep their horses on pasture or where the feet get wet, you sometimes see that. It's strange because it sometimes looks a little perforated and like it's peeling off the hoof. It's like in the top sort of inch of the hoof. And sometimes people freak out about that. Like I'm sure you see that with your horses being turned out, right? Like on a damp day in the dew. And I've certainly seen pictures on some of the online forums with people sort of going, oh my gosh, what is this? What terrible thing is happening to my horse's hoof? Because when the hoof is dry, we don't really notice it very much. But when it gets wet, it's kind of like, it's probably not a good analogy, but like a little bit like your cuticle, right? Like it can extend quite a long way down your fingernail, and you see it more when it's wet than when it's dry. So that's the periopal, and it is like this membrane-like layer of cells. And it gets worn away before it reaches the bottom of the foot. So you typically don't see it all the way down because it just wears away. And then the largest of the three layers is called the stratum medium. It's a bit of a sciencey word. The outside of which is quite rigid and it may be colored. So that's when we look at our horse's feet and we see black feet or black and white stripy feet. That color is in the stratum medium. And the rigidity of these cells protects the foot and allows for load bearing but as this layer approaches the inside of the hoof, it becomes more pliable, which allows the capsule to deform under loads. Like I mentioned earlier, it has to be both rigid and it has to be able to flex. And then the innermost part of the cell wall is called the stratum internum, inside, I guess that makes sense, right? Of which half is the laminar surface. So this is the interface that attaches the hoof wall to the coffin bone inside the hoof. So there's like three different layers. And if you ever get an opportunity to see any pictures of these layers under a microscope, they're fascinating because ultimately that inner layer, it's almost like fingers, like Velcro, right? It zips the hoof wall to the front of the coffin bone, kind of like Velcro fingers. It's really the beautiful, beautiful microscope images. So within the cells in these different areas, they have different functions, right? And different amounts of rigidity and flexibility. And they're all made up of one cell type known as epidermal cells. So this is a very long way of getting to actually answer your question. I don't think
we're going to get to it. It's good.
Right. So to finally answer your question, all these layers are made up of epidermal cells, and in turn, these epidermal cells are made up of a protein called keratin. And keratin is like a tough structural protein, and it's the same material that's in, your hair and fingernails, right? So keratin is in hair as well, and it's in nails, and it's in your horse's hooves.
So hooves are basically really thick, highly specialized fingernails.
Yeah. Absolutely, right? And that's the simple way to think about it for sure. But they're actually a much more complex, structure. And the hoof wall contains tightly packed keratinized cells, and they're actually arranged in tubules or tubes that run down, vertically down the hoof. And then inside the hoof, you've got the laminae, as I mentioned, the sole, the frog, the connective tissues, and all of it depends on healthy cell production from the coronary band. And so for folks that don't know what the coronary band is, the coronary band is that strip of soft tissue at the top of the hoof wall at the hairline at the top of the hoof. And again, you might not really see it very easily when the hoof is dry. But if you turn your horses out in dewy pasture or the rain, or you give your horse a bath for extended period of time, the coronary band will kind of like swell up, right, and becomes much more obvious. And it is this sort of, how do you describe it, Jill? I want to say tube. It's not a tube. It's like a little.
I was going to say also, a lot of people don't see it if you have a hairier horse. And I'm not saying like, a gypsy, but you might have to pull the hair up a bit off of the hoof itself to see it. But it's usually a lighter color. It's sort of a grayish color. And I think it almost has a little bit different texture, probably because that periopal is not actually on it. But it does, I don't know, it's got like a little bit of a rougher texture to it.
Yeah, and when it's wet, it's definitely squishy. I mean, it is like the cuticle. If you looked at your fingernail, right, and you look like you got your fingernail growing down, and then you've got your cuticle at the top, it's basically, it looks a little like that. Your coronary band at the top of the hoof wall is a little bit like that. It's different but similar. Look it up online if you don't know what the coronary band is. There's lots of pictures online. Yes, look at it online.
Yeah. So if the cells being produced aren't high quality, the hoof wall won't be either, correct?
Exactly. You can't build a strong structure, right, without having strong building blocks.
Okay, I think this is where things get really interesting. We've talked about what the hoof is made of, but how does it actually grow?
Yeah, that's a great question. And hoof growth is continuous. It's a continuous biological process. And it happens primarily at that coronary band, which is why we're very, anytime a horse dings its coronary band, I think any owner that, we also go, oh gosh, if they cut their coronary band or whatever, because that's ultimately going to influence that area of the hoof for a very long time, right? But yes, hoof growth originates at the coronary band, which sits at the top of the hoof wall.
So that's basically the factory.
Yep, the coronary band contains highly active cells and they're constantly dividing. So that first stage of growth is called proliferation.
Proliferation meaning rapid cell multiplication?
Look at you this morning.
Listen,
I barely had coffee.
I've had espresso. I can pronounce things.
I'm on my second cup of tea, so I guess we're both good. But yes, here we go. Here's a bit of science for you. The basal epidermal cells undergo mitosis.
Sounds exciting.
Basically what that means is they just divide and make new cells, right? So this process requires energy, obviously, because you want to make something new. So you need energy to do that. It takes amino acids to, because if you think about it, keratin's a protein, right? So we're going to need protein. So we're going to need amino acids and then minerals and vitamins because those regulate metabolic pathways. So for this process to function optimally, you've got to have the right minerals and vitamins. And so if nutrition is lacking, this is one of the first places you're going to see reduced quality is you'll see reduced proliferation. You won't see as much cell multiplication.
So those new cells are soft at first.
Very soft. Yeah. And they start as a living, hydrated epithelial cell, right? And then as they move down the hoof away from the blood supply, they enter the second phase, which is called cornification, which I think is a great word. For some reason, I like the word cornification.
It sounds very dramatic.
It kind of is. So, cornification is a process where those living cells transform. If you think like cornification just sounds tough, right? It sounds like a toughening. Like, I love the fact that the words proliferation, to proliferate, right, to increase, to multiply, makes sense. Cornification to me sounds like it's kind of getting tougher, and that's exactly what the cells are doing. They transform into these tough keratinized hoof horn, and the cells fill with the keratin proteins, and they dehydrate, and they essentially become structural material rather than living tissue. So, again, if you think about your nail, like it's very different at the base of your nail where your cuticle is versus, once you get the white bit on the end of the nail that we cut off, that's very different, right? It doesn't have blood supply. You don't cut your fingernail and your fingernails bleed, right? Because they don't have any blood supply at the end of them. So that's kind of what's happening as this hoof is growing down.
So they're basically turning into the hoof wall.
Yeah. So, and during that process, I mentioned, you needed amino acids at the beginning for the proliferation stage. You still need amino acids during the cornification stage. You need sulfur containing amino acids specifically, which would be your methionine and cysteine. And these form what are called disulfide bonds. And they're the cross links that create rigidity and strength within that keratin structure.
So if the horse doesn't get enough of those sulfur amino acids, what happens during cornification?
Yeah, the keratin structure won't cross-link properly because it doesn't have the building blocks it needs to do that. So as a result, you can end up with softer horn, flaring, cracks, crumbling because the internal architecture isn't strong enough.
And where do copper and zinc fit into this?
They play a critical role both in the proliferation stage and also cornification. So zinc supports cell division and protein synthesis, which is going on during the proliferation. And then copper helps form strong connective tissue. So it's going to be assisting in the proper keratin cross-linking.
So the whole process, proliferation, then cornification, is happening constantly?
Yeah, because your hooves are constantly growing. At least we hope they are, right? Right? We hope. Definitely, I have clients who are like, my horse's feet don't grow. But like, yes, it's happening constantly. They're generating new tissue because there's new tissue at the top. Everything else is moving down. So hooves are generally growing about 8 to 10 millimeters a month. I am terrible at converting that into inches, but what's that, like about half an inch, just under half an inch, something like that. About a third, maybe a third of an inch. Here we are, happy medium. That's
it's like, I have no idea.
Right? It's about a third of an inch a month, 8 to 10 millimeters. And so that's in an average horse. Though obviously that varies, can vary with, the horse's age, the metabolism, their overall health, maybe the season.
Which means every crack or weakness that we see today actually reflects what was happening nutritionally months ago.
Right, because if you think about how, I'm holding my fingers up, our viewers, listeners can't see this, but if you think about how long a hoof wall is, let's say, 3 or 4 inches long, and you're only growing a third of an inch a month, suddenly you start to realize that it takes many months for that hoof to grow down. So yes, when you start seeing failure in your hoof wall at the ground level, that's potentially something that reflects, the horse's nutritional status many months before.
So to summarize what we just said, step 1, the cells multiply at the coronary band. Step 2, those cells move downward and they harden through cornification. And then step 3, we either get strong, resilient hoof horn or weaker horn, depending on the raw material that was available.
Yeah, that's pretty good summary right there. And, at the end of the day, you can't shortcut biology, but you can absolutely support it, right? And again, like I think it's important to say, right, that some horses are going to be genetically predisposed to have better quality feet than others. Right? Like I can't, like if your horse has just poor hoof genetics or poor hoof quality, like genetics, like I can't do anything with that with nutrition, but I can, you can help your horse have the best quality hooves that he is genetically capable, he or she is genetically capable of having.
So now that we understand how hoofs actually grow, with proliferation at the coronary band and then cornification as the cells harden, what's typically inside a hoof supplement?
Well, once you understand the biology that we just ran through, I think the ingredients, make a lot more sense, right? So most hoof supplements are designed to support those 2 major phases, right? The cell proliferation and cornification, with the nutrients that we've just been discussing.
So let's break that down. What supports proliferation?
So as I mentioned, right, that's your rapid cell division and generation of new cells. So for that, you're going to need high quality protein and some specific amino acids to help, because you're creating a tissue that is protein. So you have to have protein to put it to create it, right? So especially, as I mentioned, you need methionine. That's the primary sulfur-containing amino acid, and that's what you're going to see in most hoof supplements. And the reason for that is because you need that sulfur for those and those specific amino acids for hoof health. And methionine can be lacking in some equine diets. Sometimes you're going to see lysine. That's our first limiting amino acid, especially in forage-based diets. Zinc, because of the role it plays in cell division and protein synthesis. And then some B vitamins might also be in there because they support energy metabolism. Like I mentioned before, like your vitamins are kind of making all your metabolic pathways function optimally, right? So if you don't have adequate B vitamins, then, new cells produced at the coronary band simply won't be as strong because, the metabolism isn't working as well. And I should mention that most healthy horses are generating their own B vitamins in the hindgut, right? The microbial population, a byproduct of microbial fermentation of forage, is B vitamins. So most healthy horses with a healthy hindgut are going to be generating adequate B vitamins, but you will sometimes, see those as well.
And then we move into cornification, the hardening stage. What's needed for that?
Yeah, so this is where you're filling those cells with keratin and they're, toughening, becoming that tough cell wall, structure. So again, you need those sulfur-containing amino acids to form those disulfide bonds. So again, that methionine, copper, which supports connective tissue strength and proper cross-linking of the keratin. So again, all these things play a role sort of in the same thing happening. Zinc, because it's involved with keratin formation. And then specifically from the B vitamins, biotin, which everybody thinks, I think when we think hoofs, and supplements, biotin is always there, right? But biotin is, has some research supporting its role in improving hoof horn hardness and reducing crumbling. So specifically, biotin will help with shelly feet and crumbling, and that's because it's required to create the substance that cements the cells together during cornification. So if you don't have adequate biotin, the cells aren't cemented together as well, so they're going to potentially pull apart and crack and flake and what have you. And then sometimes you're going to see omega-3 fatty acids because they support cell membrane integrity and also overall hoof pliability. So it's kind of interesting. There's fatty acids incorporated into many, many different tissues within the hoof. For example, the bulbs of the heel, the frog, the hoof wall, the sole, the amount of fatty acids in those areas varies and has a large part to play in how pliable those different areas of the hoof actually are.
So if I read a hoof supplement label, I'll probably see biotin, methionine, zinc, copper, maybe lysine, and possibly some fatty acid.
Yeah, exactly, because those are the key players that directly support the biology of hoof growth that we've been discussing.
So really, a hoof supplement isn't mysterious. It just targets the nutrients needed for proliferation and cornification.
Right? What a surprise.
Ta-da!
And that's, that should be, and I would throw that out there in regard to any supplement, right? Like the goal of any supplement, we hope, is that the ingredients in it are in there because they are supposed to support and target specific processes in the horse's body, right? And help them work more optimally or whatever. That should be the case of any supplement. And that's one of the things that, when I critique supplements is, are the things in there that I would expect, do they make sense? Like what process are they actually supporting? And then are they in there in an amount that would actually support that process? So, when you understand that hooves are constantly growing and undergoing rapid cell division and structural hardening, the formula of most hoof supplements becomes very logical. And, if you're looking at a hoof supplement and it has radically different ingredients in it than we just discussed, I'd be asking the question, well, what do these ingredients help, in the proliferation and cornification process? Like, how are they actively benefiting those processes in the horse's hoof? Because if they don't, why are they in a hoof supplement?
And is there actually research to support the claim? Just saying.
What was that funny? Did I just hear something? No.
So it's less magic powder and more a cellular construction crew.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like it's all the materials on your construction site, right? So that your construction crew can build the house. Right. You can't build a very good house if somebody forgot to bring the windows, right? Or didn't bring any tiles to put on the roof. Right. I mean, you might have a great house with some nice,
Might be a bit breezy on the inside.
Exactly.
Okay, this is where I think a lot of horse owners get confused. We hear that forage-based diets are often deficient in copper, zinc, maybe certain amino acids. So does that mean every horse needs a hoof supplement?
No. Right? This is where nuance matters, right? So, I get to bring up my soapbox topic again. Because before anyone asks, most horses are on a forage-based diet, right? Because they're primarily eating hay or pasture as the majority of their diet. So, for anybody that's listening who didn't hear a whole episode on, forage-based diets, I'll get off my soapbox. I could go off on a huge tangent. But yes, most horses are being fed a forage-based diet. And it's true that many forages are low in key nutrients required for optimal hoof quality, particularly the trace minerals, copper and zinc, and then sometimes the quality of the protein in that forage, might not be there or might not be available if that hay, in particular hay, is very mature.
So the gaps are real.
They are, yeah. But how those gaps are filled matters, right? If a horse is being fed a properly formulated ration balancer, for example, or if they're in harder work and they're getting, the correct amounts of fortified concentrates, they're already, receiving adequate amounts of essential amino acids like methionine, trace minerals, the copper, zinc, and B vitamins.
If they're being fed at the correct feeding rate.
Well,
that's the part that people forget.
That
Read
is the key.
label.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But that's why, take a ration balancer, for example. When you look at a ration balancer, a well-formulated ration balancing feed contains very high levels of copper and zinc. Why? Because they tend to be missing in the forage. And so if you feed that ration balancer properly, you will fill those gaps in the diet. And, why are they in there at those levels? Because we know that copper and zinc are important for hoof health and many other things in the horse's body. So that is why those nutrients are in those feeds at the levels they are in, so that they can help the horse have healthy feet and many other things.
Right. And I guess I'm just going to say this because I just feel like we can't hit this nail on the head enough, that if the bag says to feed 8 pounds of whatever feed, and you are not feeding 8 pounds, you're feeding 1 pound of it, then you need to make up that difference. So you either need to increase it to 8 pounds, which maybe that's not the case, or you need to add the ration balancer in, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, you're not going to get the benefit that's listed on the bag because you're not feeding the right amount.
Right.
So in this case, adding a hoof supplement on top might be redundant.
Yeah, if you've picked a formulated commercial feed and you're following those feeding directions, then yeah. But in some cases, and in some cases, adding, hoof supplements might create imbalances. I mean, more is not always better.
Right.
And it will just be being peed out the back end, potentially, not peed out the back end. That's not how urination works. Apparently I'm not awake this morning.
More coffee.
It would come out in feces. They do get peed out, though. They get in, they go circulate around metabolism. The body says, oh, I don't need that. And then you lose them in urine. But, it may, in some situations, if you've unbalanced the diet, prevent the absorption of other minerals. So more is not always better.
So how does a horse owner know whether they actually need a separate hoof supplement?
So, the one step is evaluating the whole diet, right? Ask yourself, is the horse eating a primarily forage-only diet? The answer is 99% of the time going to be yes, right? Is there a ration balancer? Are you feeding it at the full, recommended rate, or are you feeding another commercially available formulated feed at the recommended rate? Has your forage been analyzed? Do you actually know what's in your forage? And if the horse is getting only hay and a handful of grain, like we said, and you're not following the manufacturer's feeding rate, then they're likely, deficient in some of these key nutrients that support hoof health. And, one answer could be you grab a hoof supplement, but I would argue that it's better for the horse's overall health that you just actually feed that commercial feed, or find a commercial feed that you can feed properly, because that's going to contain so much more than the 5 nutrients that we've just been talking about related to hoof health. It's going to contain many more nutrients that are going to help the horse's entire health and entire body, not just their feet. And it will also, help their feet.
Okay, but if they're already on a well-formulated balancer,
then oftentimes, a hoof supplement's unnecessary, right? Unless there's a specific clinical issue or something going on. Or yeah, there are definitely those horses that will benefit from having an added hoof supplement. And, times when I see that be beneficial is when people are feeding a ration balancer or a commercial feed that contains nutrients that might not be in forms that are super bioavailable, right? So if you're feeding a balancer that's relying on things like zinc sulfate, copper oxide, those may not be as available to the horse as some of the what we call chelated versions of the trace minerals, which may have better absorption. And so in those situations, my solution would be to actually go find a ration balancer that has those more available minerals in them. But if that's not an option, then adding a hoof supplement can be very beneficial in those situations. And I've certainly seen that help a horse's hoof quality. And I can't tell you how many diets I've done for clients where they're feeding mostly forage and, to your point, a pound of a performance feed or a pound of a senior feed that has a much higher serving size. And they've added a hoof, the horse's feet start to fall apart, right? So they're like, oh, I must need a hoof supplement. So they add a hoof supplement. The coat doesn't look great. So they add a coat supplement. And suddenly you've got this sort of chemistry experiment going on. And then I do the diet and I get rid of their 1 pound or whatever inappropriately fed feed. And I put a balancer in and I take away the hoof supplement. And what I hear from the client is, but you've taken away my hoof supplement. My horse has poor quality feet. I need the hoof supplement. And I have to assure them, for example, that the amount of zinc that their horse is now getting with that balancer is higher than it was previously with the incorrectly fed, commercial feed and the hoof supplement. Right. So in that situation, though, what I might do if the horse has shelly or crumbly feet, I mentioned earlier that biotin can be particularly helpful for those shelly, crumbly feet. There are sources of just straight biotin out there. And so I will do biotin. But again, for biotin to really be effective on feet, the research says you need 20 to 30 milligrams of biotin per day. I know some, equine veterinary podiatrists that will do 80, 100 milligrams per day and really feel that that's very beneficial, and that can be hard to find. But I might add a biotin supplement. But generally, if my adding a balancer to the ration has given you more quality protein, more zinc, more copper than you were getting previously with your hoof supplement and whatever, then you don't need your hoof supplement. Let's see how the horse does. And typically what happens is their feet are better. And so we don't need the hoof supplement.
So the takeaway isn't buy a hoof supplement, it's balance the diet.
Exactly. Right. Hoof quality reflects overall nutritional balance. It's not just, one magic ingredient.
I think that's really reassuring. It's not about stacking supplements. It's about getting the foundation right.
Yeah. And when the foundation is correct, the hooves usually follow. Right. And that's my approach to all supplementation. Like, get the base foundation of the diet correct. It's the same with joint supplements, right? Like people, for example, want to add a joint supplement that has chondroitin sulfate in it. What people don't appreciate is that manganese, one of our trace minerals, is required for the horse to make its own chondroitin sulfate. So to me, it's a false economy to feed an unbalanced diet with inadequate manganese and then spend money on a joint supplement that gives you chondroitin sulfate, right? Why not help the horse make its own chondroitin sulfate? And then if you want, in that case, add the joint supplement. But yes, always starts with having the base diet balanced. And that's the whole point of balanced nutrition, is if you have balanced nutrition, it supports all of these processes in your horse so that all the systems of your horse can be as healthy as possible. And then we add supplements for very specific issues that are going on.
So you and I both have 14 one-hand ponies.
Yep.
Yours has always lived in Arizona. Mine has lived in 7,000 feet in Colorado, out in Iowa, standing in the grass, completely different environments. Yep. Both are in full work. Both are barefoot. Both are ridden on mixed surfaces. And what always surprises people?
That they have to have their feet trimmed as often as they do.
Right. They're both on a 4-week trim schedule, which, I've had multiple farriers because I move frequently, and they're always like, I don't think so. 4 weeks sounds too soon. Like there's no way that they need to be trimmed every 4 weeks. And we're not talking like a little bit, like they need a trim. There's a lot of hoof that's being taken off. And the reason that is just because you and I, we deal with nutrition all the time. The diets are balanced.
Right.
And they're both really simple, right? They both pretty much eat the same thing. They're getting grass hay. They get 1 pound of balancer and then some salt. I mean, there's nothing fancy happening.
Absolutely. And routinely we're taking off every 4 weeks. It's unusual that we're not taking off 1/3 of an inch.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's more. And we grow a really good sole. And yeah. And I mean, I can say for me, I mean, you're now living in a much softer environment.
Right.
And you have beautiful footing. But, my guy, is in a much more arid climate. We have very coarse sand in the arena. There's, he's working. I mean, I take him out in the state parks. I mean, I do put hoof boots on him, but I haven't always. I mean, he has gravel crunching feet. And even with all of that abrasive surface that he's working on 4 or 5 days a week, we're still taking off 1/3 of an inch every 4 weeks.
Yeah. And it's not seasonal. It's not like in the winter that changes or in the summer that changes.
No, like I said, it is routinely at least 1/3 of an inch, and sometimes it's more like 1/2 an inch.
Right.
It is significant growth. So for sure. No, that's a really good point.
So if I start feeding better protein, balance the copper and zinc, add omega-3 and a biotin, my horse's cracks disappear when? How quickly am I going to see these results?
Well, not next week. That's for sure, right? Like hoof nutrition is definitely the long game. I mean, I think I alluded earlier, right, to think about how long that hoof wall is, and it's growing, if you're lucky, 1/3 of an inch a month, right? It takes months, like 9+ months to grow a hoof all the way down. So, and you have to improve the quality of new horn growing down from the coronary band. The existing damage, is already grown out. Like you're not affecting, nutritionally, you're not affecting the surface that's in contact with the ground, right? You're affecting the top up by the coronary band, and you have to wait for that to grow down.
So the takeaway is patience is part of the supplement plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, right, the research that's been done, like in biotin, those studies were 9+ months long. Talk about long research studies that don't happen very often that long, right? But they had to do that in order for it to see the results that they were hoping to see, and they did. They took 9 months, and so you're not going to see. And you may notice a little bit, right, as it grows down at the top, right? You might notice an improvement in what that hoof quality looks like at the top of the foot. So you might see something at the top of the foot, but to your point about cracks and things, it's not going to impact that until that grows all the way down.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com.
We know that if you're like us, you're probably listening to this while driving or doing barn chores. But when your hands are free, if you'd share it with your friends on social media and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, it helps other horse lovers like you to find us.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.